The land before the story began on a quiet night, long before the modern cities, highways, and lights of the United States existed. The land itself was already alive with countless stories. If we could travel back hundreds of years, before the arrival of European ships, before the colonies, before the idea of a country called America, we would find a vast continent filled with forests, rivers, mountains, and people who had lived there for thousands of years. Tonight's journey begins not with presidents or famous battles, but with ordinary people, because the true history of a place is not only written by powerful leaders or governments, it is also written by farmers, workers, families, and communities whose lives quietly shaped the world around them. This story is inspired by the ideas found in the book A People's History of the United States, written by the historian Howard Zinn. Instead of focusing only on rulers and victories, this perspective looks at history from the viewpoint of everyday people. So take a slow breath, relax, and imagine the world as it once was. A land stretching from the cold northern forests of what we now call Canada, down through warm valleys and rivers, across endless plains, and toward the deserts and mountains of the south. Long before European explorers arrived, millions of people already lived across this land. These communities were diverse and complex. Some lived in small villages surrounded by forests, while others built large cities with temples, markets, and carefully planned streets. Many people today think of early American societies as simple tribes scattered across wilderness. But the truth is much richer and more fascinating. Across the continent, there were hundreds of cultures and languages. Some groups lived by farming corn, beans, and squash. Others followed migrating animals across the plains. Some built houses from wood and bark, while others created homes from stone or adobe clay. In the Mississippi River Valley, large cities once rose beside the riverbanks. One of the greatest was a place historians now call Cahokia. Cahokia existed centuries before European explorers arrived. At its peak, it may have had tens of thousands of people living there. The city contained massive earth mounds, wide gathering spaces, and complex social structures. Farther south, civilizations such as the Maya and Aztec built enormous cities filled with temples and marketplaces. Their knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture amazed later European visitors. Across the deserts of the American Southwest, the ancestors of today's Pueblo peoples built remarkable stone homes carved into cliffs and canyon walls. These communities farmed crops in difficult desert conditions using clever irrigation systems. Meanwhile, along the Pacific Northwest coast, societies thrived by fishing the abundant salmon rivers. They built large wooden houses and carved intricate art into massive cedar poles that told stories of ancestors and spirits. In the eastern forests, many communities formed powerful alliances. One of the most well-known was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy. This alliance united several nations under a shared system of governance. Their political structure included councils, discussions, and decision-making processes that influenced later democratic ideas. All across the continent, people lived in ways that were deeply connected to the natural world around them. Rivers provided water and transportation. Forests offered wood and animals for food and clothing. The seasons guided farming, travel, and celebrations. Life was not always peaceful. Conflicts between groups sometimes occurred, as they do in every human society, but these communities had existed for generations, developing traditions, stories, and systems that helped them survive and adapt. For thousands of years, the continent was already full of life and history, and yet, across the ocean, another world was slowly changing. In Europe during the 1400s, kingdoms were growing more powerful. Trade was expanding, new technologies were emerging, and rulers were searching for ways to increase their wealth and influence. One of the most important motivations was trade with Asia. Spices, silk, and precious goods traveled along long and dangerous land routes connecting Europe to the east. But these routes were expensive and often controlled by rival powers. European kings and merchants began searching for new paths across the oceans. They wanted faster routes to reach the riches of Asia. New navigation tools were helping sailors travel farther than ever before. Compasses, improved ship designs, and better maps slowly made long ocean voyages possible. Among the many sailors and explorers dreaming of new routes was a man named Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach Asia more quickly. Many experts of the time doubted his calculations. They knew the Earth was round, but they believed the distance across the ocean was far greater than Columbus imagined. Still, Columbus remained determined. He traveled across Europe seeking support for his journey. Eventually, the Spanish monarchy agreed to sponsor his expedition. In 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. His goal was not to discover a new continent. He believed he was heading toward Asia. But after weeks crossing the vast Atlantic Ocean, something unexpected appeared on the horizon: land. The ships had reached islands in the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had arrived near Asia, so he called the people he encountered Indians. But the land he reached was not Asia. It was part of a vast continent that Europeans had never fully explored. For the millions of people already living there, Columbus's arrival would mark the beginning of enormous change. At first, the meetings between Europeans and the local people were cautious but curious. Columbus described the people he encountered as generous and peaceful, but his writings also revealed something else. He saw them as potential laborers. He wrote that they could easily be forced to work and could help gather gold and resources. In other words, from the very beginning, economic motives were shaping the relationship. The arrival of Europeans did not instantly transform the continent, but it opened the door for future expeditions. More ships would follow, more explorers would arrive, and with them would come settlers, soldiers, missionaries, traders, and diseases that the native populations had never encountered before. Over time, these encounters would reshape the continent in ways that few people at the time could have imagined. Entire societies would face enormous pressures. Some would resist, some would adapt, some would be destroyed by forces beyond their control. But those stories unfold slowly over many years. For now, as we pause at the beginning of this long history, it is important to remember something simple yet powerful. The land that would later become the United States did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. It already had a deep and complex history. Millions of people had lived there long before the first ships crossed the Atlantic. Their cultures, languages, and traditions formed the first chapters of this story. And understanding that beginning helps us see history from a different perspective. Not just the perspective of explorers and rulers, but the perspective of ordinary people whose lives shaped the land long before the world began calling it America. In the next part of our story, we will continue exploring the early encounters between European explorers and the many native communities of the continent. These meetings would bring curiosity, trade, misunderstanding, and eventually conflict. Because history, like the slow movement of a river, often begins quietly before its currents grow stronger. Part 2. The First Encounters, when the ships of Christopher Columbus disappeared into the horizon after his first voyage. The story of the continent did not end. In many ways, it had only just begun. News of the lands across the Atlantic spread quickly through Europe. Stories of strange islands, unfamiliar people, and the possibility of gold traveled from royal courts to merchant cities. For European rulers, this news sparked curiosity and ambition. Spain and Portugal were among the first kingdoms to invest heavily in ocean exploration. The ships began crossing the Atlantic again and again, searching for new territories, new trade routes, and new wealth. But for the people already living in the Americas, These arrivals were something entirely different. At first, many of the early encounters between Europeans and native communities were cautious and uncertain. Imagine the moment from both sides. On the shore, local villagers might see enormous wooden ships approaching from the horizon, something unlike anything they had ever witnessed before. From the ships, sailors looked down at unfamiliar coastlines filled with forests, rivers, and villages. Neither side fully understood the other. Languages were different. Customs were different. Even basic expectations about the world were different. Sometimes the first meetings involved simple gestures of friendship. Food was exchanged. Small gifts were offered. Metal tools from Europe fascinated many native communities. These objects were stronger and sharper than the stone tools many societies used. In return, Europeans received food, guidance, and knowledge of the land. But these exchanges were rarely equal. European explorers arrived with powerful motivations. They were searching for gold. They were searching for land, and many of them believed they had the right to claim territories for their kings. This belief was supported by political and religious ideas that were common in Europe at the time. Some leaders argued that non-Christian lands could be claimed and ruled by Christian kingdoms. These ideas have justified the expansion of European empires across the ocean. As more ships arrived, the balance between curiosity and control slowly began to change. Spanish expeditions traveled across islands in the Caribbean. Soon they began building settlements and small forts. These settlements were often established near areas where gold or other valuable resources could be found. To gather these resources, Spanish leaders demanded labor from the local populations. Many native communities had no reason to trust these demands. For generations, they had lived according to their own traditions and systems. Now they were suddenly being asked or forced to work for strangers. Resistance appeared almost immediately. Some communities refused to cooperate. Others fled deeper into forests or mountains. But the Spanish soldiers had advantages. They carried steel weapons, armor, and horses. For many native communities, horses were completely unfamiliar animals. The sight of mounted soldiers could appear terrifying during early battles. Yet even more devastating than weapons were the diseases Europeans unknowingly carried with them. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses traveled across the Atlantic with the sailors. Because native populations had never encountered these diseases before, their bodies had no natural immunity. Entire villages sometimes became sick within weeks. These epidemics spread rapidly through communities connected by trade and travel. The result was tragic. In many regions, large portions of the population died within a short period of time. This loss weakened societies that had once been strong and stable. Meanwhile, European colonization continued expanding. Spanish conquistadors began traveling deeper into the mainland of the Americas. Some of these expeditions were driven by rumors of wealthy kingdoms filled with gold. In the early 1500s, one of the most famous expeditions was led by Hernán Cortés. Cortés and his soldiers entered the powerful Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico. The Aztec capital city, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest and most impressive cities in the world at the time. Wide causeways connected the city to the mainland. Canals flowed between neighborhoods. Markets were filled with thousands of traders selling food, clothing, pottery, and precious goods. Many European visitors were amazed by what they saw. But admiration did not stop conquest. Through alliances with rival groups, military force, and the devastating effects of disease, the Spanish eventually defeated the Aztec Empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 became one of the most dramatic moments in the early history of European colonization in the Americas. Similar patterns would appear elsewhere. Explorers arrived, alliances formed and broke, conflicts grew, and slowly European powers began establishing control over larger areas of land. Yet, even during these difficult years, native communities did not simply disappear. Across the continent, People adapted in many different ways. Some groups resisted through warfare. Others moved into remote regions to protect their independence. Some formed new alliances that allowed them to continue living within changing political landscapes. History during this period was complex and constantly shifting. While Spanish colonization expanded across parts of Central and South America, other European nations were watching carefully. England, France, and the Netherlands all began planning their own expeditions. Each kingdom hoped to gain its own share of land, resources, and influence in the New World. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, ships from these nations began arriving along the eastern coasts of North America. Small trading posts appeared along rivers and bays. Fishermen from Europe traveled regularly to the rich fishing waters of the North Atlantic. Some explorers searched for the legendary Northwest Passage, a rumored route that might connect the Atlantic Ocean to Asia to the northern parts of the continent. Most of these early attempts failed. The geography of North America was far larger and more complicated than European explorers expected. Still, the attempts continued, because the promise of wealth and land remained powerful motivations. Meanwhile, for the people living along the eastern forests and coastlines of North America, new encounters were beginning. European traders sometimes arrived offering metal tools, weapons, cloth, and other goods. In exchange, they sought furs, especially beaver pelts, which were extremely valuable in European markets. This trade created new relationships between European settlers and native communities, but it also created new tensions. Competition for valuable resources increased. Different European powers began forming alliances with different native groups. These alliances could shift the balance of power between neighboring communities. Slowly, the continent was becoming part of a global network of trade, conflict, and empire. Yet at this moment in the early 1600s, the future was still uncertain. The eastern shores of North America remained largely covered by forests and villages. European settlements were small and fragile. Many early colonies struggled to survive harsh winters, unfamiliar crops, and conflicts with nearby communities. But the pattern had begun. Ships would continue arriving. More settlers would cross the Atlantic, and the relationships between newcomers and native populations would grow increasingly complicated. The story of the land that would eventually become the United States was slowly unfolding, and in the next part of our journey, we will follow the creation of the first permanent English colonies, small settlements that would eventually grow into powerful societies. But their beginnings were far more fragile than many people realize. Part 3. The fragile beginnings of the English colonies. The early years of European exploration had already begun changing the world along the Atlantic coast of North America. Spanish explorers had traveled through the south. French traders had begun building relationships with communities around the northern rivers and lakes. But another European power was preparing to make its own attempt to settle permanently on the eastern coast of the continent, England. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, England was becoming a rising power in Europe. Its merchants wanted access to the wealth and trade that Spain had discovered in the Americas. The English crown also had other motivations. Land across the Atlantic offered new opportunities for trade, resources, and expansion of influence. But establishing a successful colony thousands of miles away from home would not be easy. The ocean voyage itself could take many weeks, sometimes months. Storms were common, food could spoil, disease often spread through clouded ships. And once settlers arrived in the new land, they faced unfamiliar climates, unknown landscapes, and the challenge of surviving far away from the comforts of Europe. Still, in the early 1600s, a group of English investors formed a company with an ambitious plan. They would build a permanent colony in North America. This company became known as the Virginia Company. In 1607, 3 ships carrying about 100 English settlers crossed the Atlantic Ocean and sailed into a wide bay along the eastern coast. They traveled up a river they would later name the James River. There, on a small peninsula surrounded by water and marshland, they established a settlement. They called it Jamestown. At first glance, the location seemed ideal. The water around the settlement created a natural barrier that could help protect them from attacks by rival European powers. But the settlers soon realized the land had many hidden challenges. The marshy environment brought swarms of insects during warm months. The water was often brackish and unsafe to drink, and the soil was not as fertile as they had hoped. Even more importantly, the settlers themselves were not fully prepared for the reality of building a new society. Many of them had been gentlemen or craftsmen in England. They were not experienced farmers or laborers. Instead of planting crops and preparing food supplies, some of them spent their time searching for gold or valuable minerals. But there was no gold waiting in the forests. As months passed, food supplies began to run dangerously low. The colony faced its first harsh winter. Disease spread quickly through the settlement. Within the first year, many of the original settlers had died. At times, it seemed as if the colony might collapse entirely. Yet the story of Jamestown was not only about the English settlers struggling to survive. The land surrounding them was home to powerful native communities. One of the most important was the Powhatan Confederacy. This alliance included many tribes living across the region. Their leader, often called Chief Powhatan by English settlers, oversaw a complex network of villages and communities. For generations, these communities had lived along the rivers and forests of the region. They hunted, farmed, and traded with neighboring groups. The arrival of the English colony introduced an unfamiliar and unpredictable presence into their world. At first, interactions between the settlers and the Powhatan communities were cautious. Sometimes they traded food and supplies. Corn, beans, and other crops from native farmers helped the struggling colony survive its early years. But trust between the two groups was fragile. The English settlers continued expanding their settlement. They cut down trees, built houses, and explored farther into the surrounding lands. From the perspective of the Powhatan communities, this expansion threatened the balance that had existed for generations. Misunderstandings also played a role. The two cultures had very different ideas about land ownership and authority. For many native communities, land was shared and used collectively. For the English settlers, land was something to be claimed, owned, and controlled. These different views made peaceful cooperation difficult. Conflicts began appearing in small but serious ways. Food shortages increased tensions. Some settlers attempted to take food from nearby villages when their own supplies ran out. In response, some native groups resisted or defended their communities. The situation moved back and forth between uneasy trade and open hostility. Despite these challenges, Jamestown managed to survive. One reason was the arrival of new ships bringing additional settlers and supplies. Another reason was the discovery of a crop that would transform the colony's economy: tobacco. Around 1612, a settler named John Rolfe successfully grew a type of tobacco that became extremely popular in European markets. Soon, tobacco plantations began spreading across the colony. This crop offered something the investors in England had hoped for: profit. As tobacco exports increased, the colony slowly became more stable. But tobacco farming required large amounts of land and labor. To grow more crops, settlers expanded farther into territories that native communities had used for generations. This expansion increased conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy. Over time, several violent wars broke out between English settlers and native groups in the region. These conflicts caused heavy losses on both sides. Villages were destroyed. Settlements were attacked. The fragile balance between cooperation and conflict slowly collapsed. Yet Jamestown continued growing. New settlers arrived each year. Plantations spread along the rivers, and the idea of permanent English colonies in North America began to feel more realistic. Still, life in these early colonies remained extremely difficult. Many settlers struggled with disease, hunger, and isolation. The dream of wealth and opportunity often collided with the harsh realities of survival. But Jamestown had done something important. It proved that a permanent English colony could exist in North America. Soon, other groups would follow. Some would arrive seeking land, others would come searching for religious freedom, and many would arrive hoping to build new lives far from the political and economic struggles of Europe. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the arrival of another group of settlers whose story became deeply connected with the early history of America. They were travelers seeking a new beginning, and their small ship would become one of the most famous vessels in American history, the Mayflower. Part 4. The Arrival of the Pilgrims and the Search for a New Life. As the early English colonies slowly struggled to survive along the eastern coast of North America, another group of travelers was preparing for a very different journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Unlike many earlier settlers who came searching for wealth or land, these travelers had a different goal. They were searching for freedom. In England during the early 1600s, religion played an extremely powerful role in society. The official church of the country was the Church of England, and the government expected people to follow its traditions and rules. But not everyone agreed with those practices. Some groups believed the church needed to be reformed and purified. They wanted to remove certain rituals and traditions that they believed did not belong in a true Christian church. These reformers became known as Puritans. Among them was a smaller group who believed the situation in England could never truly be fixed. Instead of reforming the church from within, they believed they should separate completely and build their own communities where they could practice religion freely. Because of this belief, they were often called separatists. Life for these separatists in England was not easy. The government viewed their ideas as dangerous and rebellious. Many of them faced fines, imprisonment, and constant pressure from authorities. Eventually, some of these families decided they had only one choice. They would leave England entirely. In the early 1600s, a group of these separatists moved to the Netherlands, where religious tolerance was greater. For several years, they lived in the Dutch city of Leiden. At first, life there seemed peaceful. They were finally free to worship according to their own beliefs. But over time, new challenges appeared. The community struggled economically. Many of the men worked long hours in difficult jobs to support their families. Parents also worried that their children were slowly losing their English language and traditions as they grew up in a different culture. So the group began discussing another idea. If they could travel across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, they might be able to create their own community, a place where they could build a society based on their values and beliefs. It was a risky dream. The journey would be long and dangerous. The land they planned to settle was still largely unknown. But the possibility of a fresh start felt worth the risk. With the help of investors in England, the group arranged for a voyage to North America. In 1620, about 100 passengers gathered at a port in England. Their ship was called the Mayflower. The passengers were not all separatists. Some were workers, craftsmen, and other individuals who hoped to find opportunity in the new land. Together, they prepared for the long journey across the Atlantic. The Mayflower was not a large ship by modern standards. It measured roughly 100 feet long. Inside, conditions were crowded and uncomfortable. Families slept close together below deck. Supplies were packed tightly in every available space. As the ship sailed westward, the passengers faced rough seas and powerful storms. Waves crashed against the wooden sides of the vessel. The cold wind swept across the deck. For weeks, the passengers lived in these cramped and uncertain conditions. Many became seasick. Food supplies were limited. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Yet the ship continued forward through the vast ocean. Finally, after more than 2 months at sea, land appeared on the horizon. The travelers had reached the coast of North America, but there was a problem. Their original destination had been near the existing English colony of Virginia. Instead, storms had pushed them far north. They had arrived near the shores of what is now called Cape Cod. Because they were outside the official territory of the Virginia Company, some passengers began arguing about what should happen next. Without a clear legal authority, there was concern that disagreements could create chaos, so the leaders of the group decided to create a simple agreement. This document became known as the Mayflower Compact, signed by many of the adult men on board the ship. The compact established the idea that the settlers would create their own government and make decisions together for the good of the colony. It was a small but important moment. The idea that communities could govern themselves through agreements among their members would later influence political thinking in the colonies. After signing the compact, the settlers began searching for a suitable place to build their new home. Eventually, they chose a location along the coast that offered a small harbor and nearby freshwater streams. They named the settlement Plymouth. The timing of their arrival, however, made survival extremely difficult. Winter was approaching. The settlers had little experience building homes in the harsh climate of New England. During those first cold months, the colony faced enormous hardship. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Cold temperatures spread illness through the small community. Many of the settlers grew weak from hunger and disease. By the time spring finally arrived, nearly half of the original passengers had died. Yet the colony did not disappear. The survivors continued working together to rebuild their fragile community. They built small wooden houses, they planted crops in the soil, and slowly they began learning how to live in the unfamiliar land. One of the most important moments during this time involved contact with nearby native communities. A man named Squanto, who spoke some English due to earlier contact with European traders, played a key role in helping the settlers. He showed them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. He explained which plants could be safely eaten, and he helped establish communication between the settlers and the Wampanoag people who lived in the region. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, agreed to a treaty with the Plymouth settlers. The agreement created a fragile peace between the two groups. For several decades, this cooperation helped the colony survive and grow. In the autumn following their first successful harvest, the settlers and members of the Wampanoag community shared a meal together. This gathering would later become known as the First Thanksgiving. Although the modern holiday would develop much later, the event represented a rare moment of cooperation between two very different cultures. But the future would bring many changes. As more English settlers arrived in North America, new colonies would appear along the coast. Towns would grow larger, land would become more valuable, and the peaceful balance between settlers and native communities would slowly begin to break. Yet in 1620, the small settlement at Plymouth represented something new. It was not a colony built only for profit. It was a community built by people searching for freedom, stability, and the chance to build a different kind of life. The forests around them remained vast and quiet. The ocean waves continued crashing along the shore, and the fragile story of English settlement in North America continued to unfold. In the next part of our journey, we will explore how these early colonies slowly expanded and how the arrival of more settlers began transforming the landscape of the continent forever. Part 5. The Growing Colonies and the Changing Land. As the small settlement of Plymouth slowly recovered from its difficult beginning, life in the English colonies of North America continued to change. More ships began crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Each year, new settlers arrived, carrying hopes of opportunity, land, and a better future. Some came seeking religious freedom like the Pilgrims. Others came because they believed the New World offered economic chances that did not exist in Europe. The growing number of arrivals slowly transformed the quiet coastline. Forests that had stood for centuries began to disappear as settlers cut trees to build houses, farms, and small towns. Rivers that once carried only canoes and fishing boats now saw larger ships bringing supplies and people from distant lands. But the expansion of the colonies also created new challenges. The settlers needed land to grow crops, and build communities. Yet, much of the land they wanted was already part of territories used by native communities who had lived there for generations. In the early years, some colonies attempted to maintain peaceful relationships with nearby tribes through trade and agreements. Corn, furs, and other goods were exchanged between the two groups. Native knowledge about farming, hunting, and the environment often helped the settlers survive in a land that was still unfamiliar to them. However, as the number of settlers continued increasing, these relationships became more difficult to maintain. In the region north of Plymouth, another group of English settlers arrived in the 1630s. These settlers were also Puritans, but unlike the earlier pilgrims, they came in much larger numbers. They established a new colony called Massachusetts Bay. Their main settlement, Boston, quickly became one of the most important towns in the region. The leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony believed they were creating a model society, a community built on strong religious values and strict moral rules. Life in the colony was carefully organized. Church attendance was expected. Community members were encouraged to follow shared beliefs and traditions. For many settlers, this structure created stability and order in a difficult new environment. Yet not everyone agreed with these strict rules. Some individuals who questioned the colony's religious leadership found themselves punished or forced to leave. One of these individuals was a man named Roger Williams. Williams believed that government leaders should not control religious beliefs. He also argued that the land occupied by the colonies rightfully belonged to the native communities who had lived there long before the arrival of Europeans. Because of these views, Williams was eventually banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But instead of disappearing, he traveled south and established a new settlement that later became the colony of Rhode Island. This colony was built on the idea of religious freedom. People of many different beliefs were allowed to live there without persecution. Another famous figure who challenged the authority of Massachusetts Bay was Anne Hutchinson. She held gatherings where she discussed religious ideas that differed from the teachings of the colony's leaders. Her influence worried the authorities, and she was eventually forced to leave the colony as well. These events revealed something important about the early colonies. Although many settlers came searching for freedom, their communities often struggled with the question of how much freedom individuals should truly have. As towns grew larger and more colonies appeared, the landscape of the eastern coast slowly began to change. Farm fields spread across areas that had once been dense forests. Roads connected settlements. Harbors filled with ships carrying goods between America and Europe. Trade became an important part of colonial life. Fish, timber, tobacco, and furs were shipped across the Atlantic. In return, the colonies received manufactured goods, tools, clothing, and other supplies. But economic growth also brought new systems of labor. Large farms and plantations required many workers to grow crops like tobacco. In the southern colonies, landowners began relying on indentured servants, people who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. Over time, another system of labor began appearing that would have a deep and tragic impact on the future of the colonies. The system of slavery. At first, enslaved Africans arrived in small numbers, but as plantation agriculture expanded, the demand for labor increased. More ships began carrying enslaved people across the Atlantic Ocean in what would become known as the transatlantic slave trade. These men, women, and children were taken from their homes in Africa and forced to work in harsh conditions on plantations in the Americas. Their stories would become a central part of the history of the colonies and the future United States. Meanwhile, tensions between settlers and native communities continued to grow. As colonies expanded, settlers often moved onto lands that native tribes considered part of their territories. Some agreements between settlers and tribes were broken. Conflicts slowly increased. In New England, during the 1630s, tensions between colonists and the Pequot tribe eventually led to a violent conflict known as the Pequot War. The war ended with devastating consequences for the Pequot people. Many were killed, captured, or forced to flee their traditional lands. This conflict was an early example of how the expansion of the colonies could lead to tragic violence. Despite these struggles, the colonies continued growing. More towns appeared along rivers and coastlines. Schools and churches were built. Small local governments formed to manage daily life in each settlement. For the settlers, the new world was slowly becoming home. Children were born in the colonies who had never seen Europe. New traditions and cultures began developing that blended European influences with the realities of life in North America. Yet, beneath the surface of growth and progress, deep tensions remained. Questions about land, labor, freedom, and power would continue shaping the future of the colonies. The quiet forests, rivers, and valleys of the continent were becoming part of a rapidly changing world. And in the next part of our story, we will explore how life in the colonies continued evolving and how the growing population slowly began creating new social divisions between the wealthy, the poor, and those who were forced to live without freedom. Part 6: Life in the Colonies and the Growing Divisions. As the decades passed, the English colonies along the eastern coast of North America slowly began to feel less like distant outposts and more like permanent societies. Small settlements grew into busy towns. Wooden houses lined narrow dirt roads. Smoke drifted from chimneys during cold mornings. Church bells echoed through quiet valleys as communities gathered for prayer and discussion. Children who had been born in the colonies were growing up and starting families of their own. For them, the forests, rivers, and changing seasons of North America were not unfamiliar territory. This land was home, yet daily life in the colonies was far from easy. Most people worked long hours simply to survive. Farmers rose before sunrise to care for crops and animals. Fields of corn, wheat, and tobacco required constant attention. Women managed homes, prepared food, made clothing, and cared for children. In many households, every member of the family had responsibilities. Life moved according to the rhythm of nature. Spring was the season for planting crops. Summer brought long days of labor under the sun. Autumn meant harvesting food before the cold weather arrived. Winter often brought isolation as snow covered the roads and rivers froze. In towns near the coast, life looked a little different. Merchants and traders filled small marketplaces with goods arriving from distant places. Ships brought sugar from the Caribbean, cloth from Europe, and tools from England. Colonial ports slowly became important centers of trade. Cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston began growing into busy communities filled with shops, warehouses, and shipyards. But beneath this growing economy, important social divisions were beginning to appear. Some colonists became extremely wealthy. Large plantation owners controlled huge areas of land and produced crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. These wealthy landowners often lived in large houses and held positions of political power within the colonies. Meanwhile, many other settlers struggled to survive. Small farmers sometimes owned only tiny pieces of land. Bad harvests or falling crop prices could push them into debt. Some people worked as laborers or craftsmen, earning just enough to support their families. For indentured servants, life could be even harder. These individuals had agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to America. During their years of service, they had very little freedom. They worked long hours and lived under the control of the landowners they served. Although some indentured servants eventually gained their freedom, many died before their contracts ended due to disease or harsh conditions. But perhaps the most tragic form of labor expanding in the colonies was slavery. The transatlantic slave trade continued bringing enslaved Africans across the ocean. They were transported in crowded ships under brutal conditions. Families were separated. Many people died during the long journey across the Atlantic. Those who survived were sold at auctions and forced to work on plantations, farms, and in households. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved people were not working toward freedom. They were treated as property under colonial laws. The children were often born into slavery as well. Despite these terrible conditions, enslaved communities found ways to preserve their culture, language, music, and traditions. They built families and communities even in the face of oppression. Their strength and resilience became an important part of the cultural history of America. At the same time, tensions between settlers and native communities continued growing. As colonial populations expanded, settlers pushed farther into lands that had long been used by native tribes. Forests were cleared. Rivers were claimed for mills and farms. Hunting grounds were disrupted by new settlements. For many native communities, these changes threatened their survival. Conflicts that had once been small and local began growing larger and more violent. One of the most dramatic conflicts occurred in New England during the 1670s. A war broke out between English settlers and several native tribes, led by a leader known to the English as King Philip. His real name was Metacom, a Wampanoag leader who believed the settlers were destroying his people's way of life. The conflict, known as King Philip's War, became one of the deadliest wars in early American history. Villages on both sides were destroyed. Many people died during months of fighting. By the time the war ended, the balance of power in New England had permanently shifted toward the English colonies. Native communities lost large portions of their land and influence. Despite the violence and struggles of these years, the colonies continued growing. More immigrants arrived from Europe. New towns appeared farther inland. Colonial governments slowly developed systems of laws, assemblies, and local leaders. In some colonies, settlers began electing representatives to speak for their communities. These early forms of local government allowed colonists to participate in decisions about taxes, laws, and trade. Although these systems were limited and often excluded many groups of people, they introduced ideas about representation and political participation that would later become important. Yet, the colonies were still part of the British Empire. The king and parliament in England ultimately controlled colonial trade and many important laws. For many years, this relationship seemed stable. The colonies benefited from trade with Britain. British ships protected colonial ports from rival European powers. But as the colonies grew stronger and more independent, new questions slowly began to appear. Who truly controlled the future of the colonies? Were they simply distant extensions of Britain, or were they becoming something new? These questions would not be answered immediately. They would grow slowly over time as new generations of colonists began thinking about their rights, their identity, and their place in the world. The quiet villages, farms, and ports of colonial America were slowly becoming part of a much larger story. And in the next part of our journey, we will explore how economic changes and political tensions between Britain and the colonies slowly began pushing both sides toward a conflict that would eventually reshape the entire continent. Part 7. Growing tensions between the colonies and Britain. As the colonies continued growing through the late 1600s and early 1700s, life in North America slowly became more stable and organized. Towns expanded. Farms spread farther into the countryside. Trade connected the colonies to distant parts of the world. Ships regularly sailed across the Atlantic carrying goods, people, and news between Britain and the American colonies. For many years, the relationship between the colonies and Britain seemed natural. The colonies provided raw materials such as tobacco, timber, and furs. In return, Britain sent manufactured goods like tools, cloth, and furniture. This system of trade helped both sides grow economically. But as time passed, the colonies also began developing their own identities. Generations were now being born in America who had never lived in Europe. These colonists spoke English, but their lives were shaped by the landscapes and experiences of the New World. They worked on American farms, fished American rivers, and built towns in American forests. Slowly, their sense of independence began to grow. Many colonies had their own local assemblies where elected representatives helped make decisions about taxes and laws. Although these assemblies still operated under the authority of the British Crown, they gave colonists a taste of self-government. For a long time, Britain allowed the colonies a certain amount of freedom in managing their internal affairs. But events in Europe would soon begin changing that relationship. During the mid-1700s, several powerful European nations competed for land and influence across the world. Britain and France were two of the strongest rivals. Their conflict extended not only across Europe, but also into North America. In the colonies, this struggle became known as the French and Indian War. The war began in the 1750s as both Britain and France attempted to control territory in the vast lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. These lands were important for trade, especially the valuable fur trade. Many Native American tribes also lived in these regions and had their own alliances and rivalries. Some tribes supported the French, while others sided with the British. The conflict soon spread across forests, rivers, and frontier settlements. Colonial soldiers fought alongside British troops against French forces and their allies. The war lasted for several difficult years. When it finally ended in 1763, Britain had defeated France and gained control of large areas of land in North America. At first, many colonists celebrated the victory. The French threat in the region had disappeared. But the war had also created a serious problem for Britain. It had been extremely expensive. The British government now faced enormous debts from financing the long conflict. Leaders in London began looking for ways to recover some of that money, and their attention turned toward the American colonies. From the perspective of British officials, the colonies had benefited from the war. British soldiers had protected colonial settlements and helped secure valuable land. Therefore, they believed the colonies should help pay for the costs of the war. To raise revenue, the British Parliament began introducing new taxes and regulations. One of the earliest measures was the Sugar Act, which placed taxes on imported sugar and other goods. Soon afterward came the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required colonists to purchase special stamps for printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. For many colonists, these taxes created anger and frustration. The issue was not only about money, it was about representation. Colonists argued that they should not be taxed by a government in which they had no direct representation. They had no elected representations in the British Parliament. From their perspective, it seemed unfair for distant leaders in London to impose taxes on people living thousands of miles away. Protests quickly spread through many colonial towns. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Groups of colonists gathered in public meetings to discuss their rights. Some demonstrations turned violent. Tax collectors were sometimes threatened or forced to resign from their positions. The resistance surprised British officials. Eventually, the pressure became strong enough that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. For a moment, tensions appeared to ease, but the larger conflict had not truly disappeared. Britain still believed it had the authority to govern and tax the colonies, and many colonists believed they had the right to participate in decisions affecting their lives. In the following years, new taxes were introduced, including duties on goods such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. Each new law created more protests. In colonial cities, political discussions became increasingly common. Newspapers published essays arguing about liberty, government, and the rights of citizens. Leaders such as lawyers, merchants, and writers began speaking publicly about the growing tensions with Britain. Committees formed to organize resistance and share information between colonies. These groups helped connect distant towns and cities into a broader movement. Still, not every colonist supported rebellion. Many people remained loyal to Britain. They believed the colonies were safer as part of the British Empire. Others simply feared that open conflict would bring chaos and destruction. So by the early 1770s, colonial society had become deeply divided. Some colonists demanded greater independence. Others hoped to maintain peace and loyalty to the crown. Yet events were slowly moving toward a moment when compromise would become harder and harder. In December of 1773, one protest in the city of Boston would become one of the most famous events in American history. Angry colonists boarded British ships in the harbor and threw large shipments of tea into the cold waters below. The protest became known as the Boston Tea Party. For Britain, this act was seen as a serious challenge to authority. In response, the British government passed strict laws meant to punish the colony of Massachusetts. But instead of restoring control, these actions only increased colonial anger. Across the colonies, people began asking a dangerous question. Could the colonies continue living under British rule? Or had the time come to choose a completely different path? The answer to that question would soon lead the colonies into a conflict that would change the future of North America forever. And in the next part of our story, we will follow the growing resistance as it finally turns into open rebellion, the beginning of the American Revolution. Part 8: Voices of Protest and the Growth of New Ideas. As the colonies of North America grew larger and more populated, something interesting slowly began to happen. People were starting to question the systems around them. For many years, colonial life had been shaped by powerful landowners, merchants, and royal officials who represented the authority of the British Crown. But ordinary people, farmers, workers, sailors, and craftsmen were beginning to develop their own ideas about fairness, freedom, and the rights of individuals. In towns and villages along the eastern coast, conversations about politics were becoming more common. People gathered in taverns, marketplaces, churches, and small meeting halls. There they discussed taxes, laws, trade restrictions, and the decisions made by distant leaders in London. For many colonists, the British government felt very far away. Rules were often created by people who had never seen the land or understood the challenges of life in the colonies. At first, these frustrations were quiet and scattered. But slowly, the voices of criticism began to grow louder. One major source of tension came from economic restrictions. The British government believed the colonies should serve the needs of the empire. Colonists were expected to send valuable raw materials like tobacco, timber, and crops back to England. In return, they would buy manufactured goods from British merchants. This system helped strengthen the economy of Britain. But for colonists who wanted more independence in trade and business, it often felt limiting. Merchants sometimes found themselves unable to trade freely with other countries. Farmers sometimes struggled when prices were controlled by distant markets. Over time, frustration grew among many different groups of people. Writers and thinkers in the colonies began sharing new ideas about government and society. Some of these ideas came from philosophers in Europe. These thinkers believed that governments should exist to serve the people. They argued that individuals had natural rights that no king or ruler should be able to take away. Among these rights were ideas like freedom, equality before the law, and the ability to participate in decisions that affected one's life. For many colonists, these ideas were exciting. They began imagining a world where power did not flow only from kings and empires, but from ordinary citizens themselves. Still, not everyone experienced colonial society in the same way. While some people discussed freedom and rights, others continued living under systems of inequality. Enslaved Africans were still forced to work in fields and plantations across the southern colonies. Indigenous communities continued facing pressure as colonial settlements expanded deeper into their lands. And many poor workers struggled to survive within an economic system that favored wealthy landowners. The conversations about freedom were complicated. They raised difficult questions. Could a society truly believe in liberty while still holding people in slavery? Could equality exist while large groups of people had no voice in government? These questions did not yet have clear answers, but the seeds of change were slowly being planted. Meanwhile, in the northern colonies, education and printing presses were helping ideas spread faster than ever before. Newspapers appeared in growing cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Pamphlets written by writers, thinkers, and political critics circulated among readers eager to debate the future of their society. Some of these writings challenged the authority of kings and aristocrats. Others encouraged colonists to think about building a different kind of political system. At the same time, tensions between Britain and its colonies continued to grow. Wars between European empires often extended across the Atlantic. Colonists were sometimes drawn into conflicts that were shaped by rivalries thousands of miles away. These wars were expensive, and after each conflict, the British government searched for ways to recover the money it had spent. One solution seemed obvious to leaders in London. The colonies, they believed, should help pay for the costs of protecting them. New taxes began appearing on goods used by colonists. Paper, tea, glass, and other everyday items became part of new taxation systems. But many colonists were not willing to accept these changes quietly. They believed that if they were going to be taxed, they should also have representation in the government that created those taxes. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," slowly began to circulate among colonial thinkers and activists. It captured growing frustration. Colonists did not necessarily want to separate from Britain yet, but they wanted their voices to be heard. They wanted a say in the decisions that shaped their lives. Across towns and cities, meetings were held. Petitions were written. Protests began appearing in streets and public squares. Some of these demonstrations were peaceful discussions. Others were more dramatic, with crowds gathering to challenge government officials. The relationship between Britain and its colonies was slowly entering a new and uncertain stage. What had once been distant disagreements was gradually becoming something larger, something that would reshape the future of the continent. But at this moment in our story, the outcome was still unknown. The colonies were changing. New ideas were spreading. Ordinary people were beginning to imagine a different kind of society. And somewhere within these quiet discussions and growing tensions, the early beginnings of revolution were starting to take shape. Part 9. Rising tensions across the colonies. As the years passed, the relationship between Britain and the American colonies continued to grow more complicated. What had once been small disagreements about trade and taxes slowly began turning into deeper political conflicts. From the perspective of the British government, the situation seemed simple. Britain had spent large amounts of money protecting its colonies during wars against other European empires, especially France. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay for that protection. But for many colonists living across the Atlantic, things did not feel so simple. They believed they were being asked to follow laws and pay taxes created by a government where they had no direct voice. In Britain, members of parliament represented towns and regions within the country, but the American colonies had no representative sitting in that parliament. For many colonists, this felt unfair. It slowly became one of the most important political arguments of the time. If people were expected to obey laws and taxes, should they not also have the right to participate in the government that created them? These ideas began spreading through newspapers, pamphlets, and public conversations. Printers played an important role in this growing debate. Pamphlets explaining political ideas were printed and shared across towns and cities. Some writers argued that the British government had the authority to tax the colonies. Others argued that colonists possessed the same rights as citizens living in Britain itself. These debates were not limited to wealthy leaders. Ordinary workers, sailors, and farmers also joined the conversations. In taverns and meeting halls, people discussed politics late into the night. Merchants worried about how new trade laws would affect their businesses. Farmers worried about rising costs. Dock workers and sailors felt the direct impact when trade slowed down. One of the most controversial laws passed by the British government was the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required that many printed materials carry an official government stamp. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards would require this stamp. And of course, the stamp had to be purchased. To British leaders, this tax seemed small, but in the colonies, it felt like a major step toward greater control. Printers, lawyers, merchants, and many others immediately felt the impact. Protests quickly began appearing across colonial cities. Crowds gathered in the streets. Effigies representing tax officials were sometimes hung or burned in public demonstrations. Groups of activists formed organizations to resist the new taxes. One of the most famous groups became known as the Sons of Liberty. Members of this movement organized protests, encouraged boycotts of British goods, and spread messages about colonial rights. Merchants agreed not to import certain products from Britain. This boycott created economic pressure. British businesses began losing money because colonial customers stopped buying their goods. Eventually, the pressure worked. In 1766, the British government repealed the Stamp Act. For many colonists, this felt like a victory. It seemed to prove that collective protest could influence powerful governments. But the larger disagreement had not truly been resolved. British leaders still believed Parliament had the authority to govern the colonies. Colonists still believed their rights were being ignored. Over the next several years, more taxes and trade regulations appeared. Each new law added another layer of tension. Meanwhile, British troops were sometimes sent to colonial cities to maintain order. Their presence created unease among many residents. In Boston, the situation became especially tense. The city had become a center of protest and political discussion. Crowds sometimes gathered near government buildings and military posts. Arguments between soldiers and civilians occasionally turned heated. Then, one cold evening in March of 1770, a confrontation took place that would echo through history. A crowd gathered near a group of British soldiers. Words were exchanged. Snowballs, ice, and debris were thrown. In the confusion and tension of the moment, the soldiers fired their weapons. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay wounded or dead. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. News of the incident spread quickly through newspapers and pamphlets. For some colonists, it became a powerful symbol of British oppression. For others, it was a tragic moment caused by rising tensions on both sides. Regardless of perspective, the relationship between Britain and its colonies was now far more fragile than it had been only a decade earlier. Distrust was growing, anger was growing, and across the colonies, more and more people were beginning to ask a question that once seemed impossible. What if the colonies did not remain part of the British Empire at all? At this point in our story, independence was still only an idea discussed quietly by a few thinkers. But the path toward a revolutionary future was slowly beginning to unfold. Part 10. The Edge of Revolution. As the 1770s approached, the relationship between Britain and the American colonies had become deeply strained. Years of arguments, protests, and political debates had slowly transformed the atmosphere across colonial towns and cities. What had once been distant disagreements about taxes and trade were now becoming serious questions about power, authority, and the future of the colonies themselves. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown. They shared language, culture, and traditions with the people of Britain. Yet at the same time, their daily lives in North America had created a growing sense of independence. The vast distance across the Atlantic Ocean meant that colonists often handled their own local affairs. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and local councils had become part of everyday political life. These institutions gave colonists a taste of self-government, and once people experience a voice in their own decisions, it can be difficult to accept losing that voice. Meanwhile, the British government faced its own challenges. The empire was large and expensive to manage. Leaders in London believed stronger control over the colonies was necessary to maintain order and stability. In their view, the laws and taxes placed on the colonies were reasonable. But from the perspective of many colonists, these actions felt like attempts to take away freedoms they believed they already possessed. In 1773, a new law created another moment of tension. The British government granted a special privilege to the East India Company, allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at lower prices. On the surface, the tea would actually become cheaper for colonial buyers, but the law also reinforced the principle that Britain had the authority to tax the colonies. For many activists in the colonies, this principle was the real issue. They feared that accepting the tea tax would mean accepting the idea that Parliament could control colonial trade and taxation without colonial representation. In the city of Boston, resistance to the tea shipments grew quickly. When ships carrying tea arrived in the harbor, protesters demanded that the cargo be sent back to Britain. But the governor of Massachusetts refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading their goods. Tension filled the cold December air of 1773. Then, one evening, a group of colonists took dramatic action. Disguised in simple costumes, they boarded the ships in Boston Harbor. Working quickly and quietly, they broke open large wooden chests filled with tea. One by one, the chests were thrown into the dark water below. By the end of the night, hundreds of chests of tea floated in the harbor. This event would later become known as the Boston Tea Party. To the protesters, it was a powerful statement against unfair taxation. To the British government, it was an act of rebellion. The response from Britain was swift. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws designed to punish Massachusetts and restore order. These laws became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Local self-government in Massachusetts was greatly restricted. British officials were given greater authority. For many colonists, these punishments felt extreme. Even people in other colonies who had not participated in the protests began to worry about their own rights. If Britain could impose such harsh measures on one colony, what might happen next? In response, colonial leaders from different regions began discussing cooperation. Representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for a meeting known as the First Continental Congress. There, they debated how the colonies should respond to British actions. Some delegates hoped reconciliation with Britain was still possible. Others believed the colonies must prepare to defend their rights more strongly. For the moment, the Congress agreed on a strategy of economic resistance. They organized boycotts of British goods and called for unity among the colonies. Meanwhile, tensions on the ground continued to rise. British troops remained stationed in parts of Massachusetts. Local militia groups quietly began preparing for the possibility of conflict. Weapons were stored. Training drills were held. Still, many people hoped that war could be avoided. No one could yet know how quickly events would soon unfold. Because in the spring of 1775, a small confrontation in the countryside of Massachusetts would ignite a conflict that would change the course of history. A conflict that would eventually lead to the birth of a new nation. But for now, the colonies stood balanced on the edge of revolution, uncertain of what the coming days would bring. Part 11. The Dawn of a New Nation. By the early months of 1775, the tension between Britain and the American colonies had reached a point where peace was becoming harder to imagine. For years, colonists had debated taxes, representation, and the authority of the British Parliament. Protests had taken place in cities like Boston. Petitions had been written. Delegates had gathered to discuss solutions. But now, the situation was slowly moving beyond words. British leaders had ordered troops to maintain control in the colony of Massachusetts, where resistance had grown strongest. At the same time, colonial militias were quietly preparing themselves. These militias were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and ordinary townspeople who trained occasionally to defend their communities. Across the countryside, people began storing supplies. Gunpowder, weapons, and food were collected in hidden locations. Both sides sensed that conflict might soon arrive. Then, in April of 1775, British troops received orders to march from Boston to the nearby town of Concord. Their mission was to locate and seize colonial military supplies that had been gathered there. But the countryside was watching. Messengers and riders carried news quickly through the night. One of the most famous riders was Paul Revere, who helped warn nearby towns that British soldiers were on the move. As the British troops approached the town of Lexington in the early morning hours, they encountered a small group of colonial militia waiting on the village green. No one knows exactly who fired the first shot, But suddenly the quiet morning air was broken by the sound of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, several colonial militiamen lay wounded. The British soldiers continued toward Concord, where more militia forces were gathering. Along the roads, tensions continued to grow. Soon the British troops found themselves facing increasing resistance. Colonial fighters used the forests and stone walls along the road to launch attacks as the British soldiers attempted to return to Boston. The battles of Lexington and Concord had begun. These were not large battles by the standards of European warfare, but they marked something important. The conflict between Britain and its colonies had now turned into open fighting. News of the battles spread rapidly across the colonies. Militia groups began marching toward Boston. Within weeks, thousands of colonial fighters had surrounded the city. Meanwhile, political leaders continued meeting to discuss the future. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. Delegates debated what should happen next. At first, many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. But as the fighting continued, opinions slowly began to change. 1 year later, in July of 1776, the Congress made a decision that would shape the future of the continent. They approved a document known as the Declaration of Independence. This document announced that the 13 colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they declared themselves to be free and independent states. The words of the declaration spoke about equality, natural rights, and the idea that governments should exist with the consent of the people. For many colonists, these ideas represented a hopeful vision of a new society. But the path ahead would not be easy. The war for independence would continue for several more years. And even after independence was achieved, the young nation would face many challenges. Questions about freedom, equality, land, and power would continue shaping the country for generations. The story of the United States would grow into something complex and often difficult, because the history of any nation is never simple. It is built from the experiences of millions of people, leaders and workers, soldiers and families, dreamers and critics. Tonight we have only followed the earliest chapters of that long story. From the ancient civilizations that once filled the continent, to the arrival of European explorers, to the growing tensions that eventually led to revolution. History is not just a list of events. It is a collection of human experiences that continue to shape the world around us. And as our story gently comes to a close tonight, we can imagine the quiet landscapes of early America once again. Forests moving softly in the wind, rivers flowing through valleys, and people across the land beginning a new chapter in the long journey of history. Thank you for listening.